Oh boy, that's the wrong side. Welcome to a new episode of Holiday Frights. This is a book called Victorian Christmas Stories. They told Christmas stories, scary stories, during the Victorian era. And that's why we hear in the famous song sung by Andy Williams. And one of the lyrics is, "There be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago." So here is one story I'll be reading called The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood in 1908. When the words "not guilty" sounded through the crowded courtroom that dark December afternoon, Arthur Wilburn, the great criminal KC, and the leader from triumphant defense, was represented by his junior, Bud Johnson, his private secretary, carried out the verdict across his chambers like lightning, pardon me. "It was that we expected, I think," said the barrister without emotion, "and personally I'm glad to see the case is over." There was nothing particular sign of pleasure that his defense of John Turk, the murdered on a plea of insanity. He had been successful, for no doubt he felt, as everyone who had watched over the case felt, the man had never better deserved the gallows. "I'm glad too," said Johnson. He sat in the court for 10 days watching the face of the man who carried out the callous detail of the most brutal and cold-blooded murders in recent years. B. Counsel glanced up at his secretary. They were more than employed for family and other reasons. As they sat, "Ah, I remember, yes," he said with a kind smile. "And you want to stay away for Christmas? You're going to skate and ski in the Alps, aren't you? If I was your age, I would too." Johnson laughed shortly. He was a young man of 26 years, with a delicate face like a girl's. "I can catch the morning boat now," he said, "but that's not the reason why I'm glad this trial is over. It's over because I've seen the last of the man's dreadful face. It's positively haunted me. Bat-like white skin, with black hair brushed lower over his forehead. This thing I shall never forget." And described the way the dismembered body was crammed and packed with lime into that. "This guy sounds like a vampire." "Don't dwell on it, my dear," interrupted the other, looking at him curiously about his keen eyes. "Don't think about it. Such pictures have a trick of coming back when one least wants them." He paused a moment. "Now go," he added presently, "and enjoy the holiday. I shall want all of your energy for my parliamentary work when you get back. And don't break your neck skiing." That's so nice of her to say. Johnson shook hands and took his leave at the door as he turned suddenly. "I knew that was something I wanted to ask," he said. Would you mind lending me one of your ski bags? It's too late to go and get one tonight, and I'll leave in the morning before the shop opens. Of course, I'll send Henry over with it to your rooms. You shall have it the moment I get home." "I promise to take good care of it," said Johnson gratefully, delighted to think that 30 hours he would be near the brilliant sunshine of the high Alps in the winter. And I thought of that criminal court as he would like an evil dream in mind. He dined at the club and went to Bloomsbury, as he occupied the top floor with one of those old gaunt houses in which the rooms were large and lofty. The floor below his own vacant and unfurnished. Below that there were other lodgers he did not know. It was cheerless. It looked forward to a hearty change. The night even more cheerless. It was miserable, so few people were about. The cold, sleety rain was driving down the streets before the knees of the east wind, like he had never felt. It howled dismally among the big, gloomy houses and great squares. When he reached the rooms, he heard a whistling sound and shouting coming over the world of black roofs and beyond the window. In the hall, he met his landlady sharing a candle from the drafts with her hand. Shading a candle from the drafts with her hand. "This come by a man from Mr. Wilburn, sir." She pointed to what was evidently a kit bag, and Johnson thanked her and came upstairs with him. "I shall be going abroad in the morning for 10 days, Mrs. Monks," he said. "I have an address for letters. And I hope you'll have a very Merry Christmas, sir," she said in a raucous, wheezy voice, and suggested spirits and better weather than this. "I hope so too," replied the lodger, shuddering as little as the wind roaring down the street said. And he got upstairs and heard the sleet volleying across the window panes. He put his kettle on to make a cup of coffee when he sat about, putting a few things in order for his absence. "Now I must pack such things," he said, laughing to himself as he set to work at once. He liked the packing, for I thought the snow in the mountains so vividly before him made him forget the unpleasant scenes of the past 10 years. Beside, it was elaborate in nature. His friends had lent him the very thing, a stout canvas bag, sack-shaped with holes around the neck for the brass bar and padlock. It was a bit shapeless through, but not too much to look at. Its capacity was unlimited. There was no need to pack carefully. He shoved in his waterproof coat, his fur cap and gloves, his skates and climbing boots, his sweaters, snow boots, and ear caps. And then on the top of these, he pulled his woolen shirts, underwear with thick socks, puttees, and knickerbockers. The dress suit came next, at the base, in case the hotel people dressed for dinner. And then, thinking of his best way to pack his white shirt, caused a moment to reflect. Bats, the worst of the kit bags, had mused vaguely, standing in the center in the sitting room where he had come to fetch some string. It was 10 o'clock. A furious gust of wind rattled the windows as though to hurry him up, and he thought with pity of the door Londoners whose Christmas would be spent in such climate. While he was skimming over the snowy Alps, his bright sunshine dancing in the evening with rosy-cheeked girls. He remembered. That reminded him. He must put on his dancing pumps and evening socks. He crossed over from the sitting room to the cupboard on the landing where he kept his linen. As he did so, he heard someone coming softly up the stairs. He stood still on the landing. It was Mrs. Monk's step, he thought. She must be coming home with the last post. And then steps ceased suddenly and heard no more. They were at least 2 flights down, and he came to the consultation where they were too heavy to be those of his bibulous landlady. No doubt they belonged to a late lodger who had mistaken his floor. As he went to his bedroom, he packed his pumps and dress shirts as best as he could. A kit bag at the time was 2/3 full. He stood upright on its base like a sack on the floor. For the first time he noticed that it was old and dirty, the canvas faded and worn, that it had obviously been subjected to rather rough treatment. It was not a very nice bag to have sent him, certainly not a new one, or one that his chief valued. He gave the matter passing thought and went on his packing. Once or twice, however, he caught himself wondering if he could have been wandering down below, for Mrs. Monk's had come up with letters and the floor was empty and furnished. From time to time, moreover, he almost certain he heard a soft tread of someone padding about over the bedboards cautiously, stealthily, as silently as possible, and further, that the sounds had only lately come distractingly near. For the first time of his life, he began to feel creepy, that as though to emphasize the feeling, to add an odd thing that happened as he left the bedroom, having just packed his white shirts. He noticed that the top of the kit bag lopped over towards him with an extraordinary resemblance to a human face. The canvas fell into a fold like a nose and a forehead, and a brass rings and padlock just filled the position of the eyes. A shadow, or what it is, travel stain. For he thought not to tell exactly, looked like hair. It gave him a rather turn, for it was so absurdly, so outrageously like the face of John Turk, the murderer. He laughed and went into the front room where the light was stronger. That horrid case had got on his mind. He thought, it shall be laid. I shall be glad of a change of scene and air in the sitting room. However, he was not pleased to hear again the stealthy tread upon the stairs, and to realize that it was closer than before. It was mistakenly real. At this time he got up and went over to see what it could be, creeping about the upper staircase so late an hour. My fire has gone out. What a shame. But the second ceased, and there was no one on the visible stairs. He went for below not without trepidation, and turned on electric light to make sure that no one was hiding in the empty rooms of the unoccupied suite. But there was a stick of furniture large enough to hide a dog. When he called over the banisters to Mrs. Monk's, there was no answer, and his voice echoed into the dark vault of the house and was lost in the roar of the gale and howled overside. Everyone in bed and asleep, everyone except himself, the owner of the soft, stealthy thread. His absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. It must have been the wind after all, and it seemed so very real and close, I thought. He went back to his packing, and it was this time getting on towards midnight. He drank his coffee up, lit another pipe, the last before turning in. It's difficult to say at what point fear begins, what caused that fear not plainly before the eyes. Impressions gathered on the surface of the mind, film by film. Ice gathered upon the surface of the windowsill, but often so lightly that they claim no different recognition from the consciousness. Then a point is reached, and the accumulated impressions became different emotion. The mind realizes that something has happened. With something of a start, Johnson suddenly recognized that he felt nervous, oddly nervous, and also for some past time the causes of the feeling had been gathered slowly in his mind, and it had only just reached a point where he was forced to acknowledge them. It was singular and curious malaise that had come over him, and he hardly knew what to make of it. He felt as though they were doing something that was strongly objected by the other person. Another person moved who had some right to object. It was a most disturbing and disagreeable feeling, not unlike the present promptings of his conscience, almost in fact as it were doing something he knew to be wrong. Yet he searched vigorously and honestly in his mind. He could nowhere lay a finger upon the secret of the growing uneasiness that perplexed him. More, it distressed and frightened him. Pure nerves, I suppose, he said aloud and forced a laugh. Mountain air will cure that. Ah, he added, still speaking to himself. And that reminds me, my snow glasses. He was standing by the door of the bedroom during the brief soliloquy. As he passed quickly towards the sitting room to fetch from the cupboard, he saw the corner of his eye an indistinct outline of a figure standing in the stairs. A few feet from the top, it was someone in the stooping position with one hand on the banisters and face peering up towards the landing. And the same moment he heard a shuffling footstep. The person who had been creeping about below all this time had at last came up to his own floor. Who in the world could it be? And what in the name of heaven do you want? Johnson caught his breath sharply and stood stock still. Then, after a few seconds' hesitation, he found his courage and turned to investigate. The stairs, he saw to his utter amazement, were empty, and there was no one. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and something about the muscles of his legs gave a little and grew weak. For the space of several minutes, he peered steadily into the shadows that congregated about the top of the staircase where he had seen the figure. Then he walked past, almost ran, in fact, into the light of the front room. But hardly as he passed inside the doorway, when he heard someone come up the stairs behind him with a quick bound and go swiftly into the bedroom. It was heavy, but at the same time a stealthy footstep, the tread of somebody who did not wish to be seen. And that was the precise moment that the nervousness he had hitherto experienced leaped the boundary line and entered the state of fear, almost acute reasoning fear. Before it turned into terror, there was further boundary to cross. Beyond that, again, they lay the region of pure horror. Johnson's position was an inevitable one. By Jove, that was someone on the stairs then, he muttered, his flesh crawling all over. Whatever it was, he was now gone into my bedroom. His delicate pale face turned slightly white, and some minutes later he hardly knew what to think. Then he realized intuitively the delay only set a premium fear, and he crossed the landing boldly and went straight into the other room, where a few seconds before the steps had disappeared. Who's there? Is that you, Mrs. Monks? He said aloud, as he went and heard the first half of his words echo down the empty stairs, while the second fell dead against the curtains in the room, and apparently held no other human figure than his own. Who's there? He called again, in a voice unnecessarily loud, and that only just held him firm. What do you want here? The curtain swayed slightly, and he saw it. His heart felt as it almost missed a beat. Yet he dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. The window streamed with rain, and all that he met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards held nothing but rows of clothes hanging motionless. Under the bed there was no sign of anyone hiding. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and he said something, but all tripped him. And turning with a sudden spring in alarm, he saw the kit bag. Odd, he thought. That's not where I left it. A few moments before, it had surely been on his right, between the bed and the bath. He did not remember having moved it. He was very cautious with the word. What in the world was the matter with everything? All his senses gone queer. A terrific gust of wind tore at the windows, dashing the sleet against the glass with the force of a small gunshot, and then fled away howling dismally over the waste of Bloomsbury roofs. A sudden vision of the Channel the next day arose in his mind, and he recalled two realities. There was no one here at any rate. That's quite clear, he exclaimed aloud. Yet at the time he uttered that, he knew perfectly that his words were not true, that he had not believed it himself. He felt exactly as someone was hiding close behind him, watching all of his movements, trying to hinder his packing in some way. Two of my senses, he added, keeping up with pretense. He played me the most absurd tricks, and the steps I heard and the figure I saw were both entirely imaginary. I went back to the front room, poked the fire into a blaze, and sat down before to think. What impressed him more than anything else was the fact that the kit bag was no longer where he left it. It had been dragged nearer to the door. What happened afterwards that night happened, of course, to a man already excited by fear, was perceived by a man that had not the full and proper control before the senses. Outwardly, Johnson remained calm, master of himself to the end, pretending to the very last that everything he witnessed had a natural explanation. It was merely delusions of his tired nerves. But inwardly, in his very heart, he knew, as long as someone had been hiding upstairs in the empty suite when he had seen it, that this person had watched his opportunity and then stealthily made his way up to the bedroom, where he saw and heard afterwards the moving of his kit bag to the other things of this story to tell was caused directly by the presence of the invisible person. And it was here that he most desired to keep his mind in thoughts controlled. The vivid creatures received day after day upon the metal plates exposed in the courtroom of the Old Bailey came strongly to light and developed themselves in the dark room of his inner vision. Unpleasant haunting memories gave way of coming to life again when the mind least desires them in the silent watches of the night, on the sleepless pillow during the lonely hours spent by sick and dying beds. So now, in the same way, Johnson saw nothing but a dreadful face of John Turk, the murderer, lowering at him from every corner of his mental field of vision. White skin, evil eyes, fringed black hair, lower over the forehead, and the pictures of the 10 days in court crowded back into his mind, unbidden and very vivid. "This is all rubbish and nerves," he exclaimed at length, springing with sudden energy in his chair. "I'll finish by packing and going to bed. I'm overwrought, overtired. No doubt at this rate I shall hear steps and things all night." But the face was deadly white all the same. He snatched up his field glasses and walked across the bedroom, humming a music hall song as he went, to trifle too loud to be natural. Instead, he crossed the threshold and stood within the room. Something turned cold about his heart, and he felt the very hair on his head stand up. The kit bag lay close in front of him, several feet nearer the door than he had felt it, and it just over crumpled top, he saw the head and face slowly sinking down at the sight, and thought somebody was crouching behind him. And it was at that moment sound like a draw, slight and distinctly audible in the stir about with him between the gusts and the storms outside. Johnson had overcome the willpower, and the girlish indecision of his face indicated, but it was first such a wave of terror came over him that for some seconds he could do nothing but stand there. A violent trembling ran down the back of his legs, and his conscious of a full, almost hysterically impulse to scream loud. The sight seemed to be very clear. The air still quivered within him. It was unmistakably a human sigh. "Who's there?" At length, finding his voice, he thought he meant to speak with loud decision tones, but on the inside in a faint whisper, for he had partly lost control of his tongue and lips. He stepped forward, where he could now see around and over the kit bag. Of course, there was nothing there. Nothing he had but the faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands and threw open the mouth of the sack, and it had fallen over, only being 3 parts full, when he saw for the first time the first time that round inside. For 6 inches from the top ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was old, faded, blood-stained. In the same moment, the kit bags gave a faint, unmistakable lurch forward towards the door. John collapsed backward, searching with his hands for the support of something solid, and the door began being further from him than he realized, received his weight just in time to prevent from falling, and shut with a resounding bang. At the same moment, the swing of his left arm accidentally touched the electric switch and the room lights went out. It was an awkward, distinguishable predicament, as if Johnson had not been possessed of real pluck, but he had done all manner of foolish things. And it was, however, he pulled himself together and groped furiously for a little brass knob to turn the light on again. But the rapid closing of the door set his coats hanging on and swinging, and his fingers became entangled. Entangled in the confusion of his sleeves and pockets, so that it was some moments before he found the switch. In those moments, bewildered terror, 2 things happened that sent him beyond recall over the boundary into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bag shuffling heavily across the room in jerks, and close in front of his face sounded once again the sigh of a human being. As his anguish and efforts to find the brass button on the wall, he nearly scraped his nails with his fingers. And even then, in those tantalizing moments of alarm, so swift and alert were the impressions of a man keyed up by a vivid emotion, he had time to realize that he dreaded the return of the light, that it might be better for him to stay hidden in the merciful screen of darkness. This reminds me of some people I used to hunt back then. It was in the impulse for a moment, however, that before he had come to act upon it, he yielded automatically. The original desire of the room was fooled again with light, but the second instinct had been right. It would have been better for him had have stayed in the shelter of the kind darkness, for those close before him bent over a half-packed kit bag. Near as life in the merciless glare of the electric light stood the figure of John Turk, the murderer. They were 3 feet from him. The man stood, the fringed black hair marked plainly against the pallor of the forehead, and the whole horrible presentation of the scoundrel as vivid as he had seen the day after day in the Old Bailey, when he stood there in the dock, cynical and callous, under the very windows of the gallows. In a flash, Johnson realized what it all meant. The dirty, much used bag smeared with crimson, with the top the dreadful stretched condition of the bulging sides. He remembered his victim's body was stashed in a canvas bag for burial. The ghastly dismembered fragments forced with lime in the bag, and the bag itself produced as evidence, and it came back clearly as day. Very softly and stealthily, his hand, oops, it was a bunny rabbit. Oh, vampire scared a bunny rabbit. Softly and stealthily, he had Hoke groped behind him as a handle of the door. He could actually turn it, and the very thing that the most of all dreaded came about. And John Turk lifted his devil's face and looked at him. At the same moment, the heavy sigh passed through the air, and the room formulated somehow into words. It's my bag, and I want it. Johnson remembered drawing the door open and falling into the heap on the floor of the landing. He tried frantically to make his way into the front room. He remained unconscious for a long time. It was still dark when he opened his eyes and realized that he was lying stiff and bruised on the cold boards. Then he remembered of what he had seen rushed back to his mind, and he promptly fainted again. When he woke the second time in a wintry dawn, was just beginning to peep into the windows, painting the stairs in the cheerless, dismal gray. He remembered to crawl in front of the door and cover himself with an overcoat on the armchair, where at length he fell asleep. A great glamour woke him. He recognized Mrs. Monk's voice, loud and voluble. Wait, you ain't in bed, sir? Are you ill or anything happened? And there's an urgent gentleman to see you, and thought it was 7 o'clock, and who is it? He stammered. I'm all right, thanks. Fell asleep in the chair, I suppose. Someone from Mr. Wilbrum's, he says. He ought to see you quick before you go abroad, I told him. Show him up, please, at once, said Johnson, whose head was whirling and his mind was still full of dreadful visions. Mrs. Wilburn came, and the many apologies explained briefly and quickly at the absurd mistake that he had made, and that wrong kit bag had been sent over night before. Henry somehow got hold of that one from the courtroom. Mrs. Wilbur only discovered it when he saw his own laying in the room, and asked why it had not gone to you. The man said, "Must have brought one from the murder case instead, sir. I'm afraid," the man continued without the ghost of expression on his face, "the one John Turk packed the dead both in. Mrs. Wilbur's awful upset about it, sir, and told me to come over first thing in the morning with the right one, just as you were leaving by the boat." He pointed to a clean-looking kit bag on the floor, which he had just brought. "It was to bring another one back," he said, just added casually. And some minutes later, John could find no voice. He at last pointed in the direction of the bedroom. "Perhaps it would be kindly unpack it for me, sir. Just empty the things on the floor." The man disappeared into the room and was gone for 5 minutes. Johnson heard shifting to and fro in the bag and the rattle of skates and boots, then being unpacked. "Thank you, sir," the man said, returning with the folded bag in his arm. "And can I do anything to help you, sir?" "What is it?" asked Johnson, seeing that he still had something he wished to say. The man shuffled and looked mysterious. "Beg pardon, sir, but knowing your interest in the Turk case, I thought you'd maybe like to know what happened." "Yes. John Turk killed himself last night with poison immediately on getting his release. and he left a note for Mr. Wilbraham saying that he had been much obliged if they'd give him, that they'd put him away, save as a woman he murdered in the old kit bag. What time did he do it? Johnson asked. 10 o'clock last night, sir, the warder said. So what do you think about that? Do you think it was Mr. Turk and Mr. Johnson's kit bag? Or was Mr. Johnson dreaming and imagining this whole thing? These stories were very popular in the 1800s, early 1900s, to tell at Christmas parties as means of entertainment. This was one of many of the stories that they told. Most were based on real life, others were fiction. So I hope you enjoyed this. I will be doing it again soon. It will be a new show I will be doing every December. I have not quite yet figured out the title for it, but I appreciate your patience, and I'm sorry that my fire went out. I wanted to use it for ambience. So, anyway, all of you have a very good night. Rest peacefully, and don't leave your kit bag on the floor, for you never know what will happen. Until then, sweet dreams. And this is Count Vampire saying, be kind to everyone. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to your animals. They know nothing but unconditional love. Stay spooky, my friends. Until then, we will see you next week.